The galaxy had been quiet for 3,000 years. Not the good kind of quiet that comes with peace, but the heavy silence that follows after someone powerful tells everyone else to shut up. In the center of the Milky Way, on a massive space station called the Grand Nexus, 12 alien species ruled over everything they could see. They called themselves the Hegemony Alliance, though nobody had asked them to be in charge. They just were, and that was how things had always been. The station was bigger than most planets. Its chrome and crystal towers stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, each one housing billions of beings from the ruling species. Ships the size of cities docked at its ports every day, bringing tribute from thousands of worlds across the galaxy. Commander Zefter of the Catherian Empire stood on the observation deck of Tower Prime, watching the endless stream of cargo vessels through eyes like liquid mercury. His people had been part of the hegemony for over 2 millennia, and his family had served as administrators for just as long. The view never got old. Each ship carried something valuable: rare minerals from the outer rim, exotic foods from tropical worlds, art and literature from species that had been guided into the hegemony's embrace. Most importantly, they carried people, workers, laborers, soldiers when needed. The hegemony had perfected the art of control. They didn't need to be cruel, though they could be when necessary. They simply made it clear that cooperation led to comfort, while resistance led to very uncomfortable consequences. Most species learned this lesson quickly. Zefter's communicator buzzed softly. A message from the Resource Management Division appeared in glowing text before his eyes. Another young species had been discovered in Sector 7739. Primitive bipeds, who had barely learned to travel between planets. They called themselves humans. He pulled up their file on his personal display. The survey team's report was typical of newly discovered species: limited technology, simple social structures. Number: significant military capability. Their home world, designated as Terra 3, orbited a yellow star and contained abundant water and mineral resources. The humans had managed to establish colonies on 12 nearby worlds over the past 50 years. Impressive for such a young species. But nothing the hegemony hadn't seen before. The Deltari had colonized 30 systems before being brought into the fold. The Nexari had reached 47 worlds. All of them now served the greater good under hegemony guidance. Zefter made a note in the file. Standard Protocol 7 would apply. The humans would be allowed to continue their basic development, while hegemony observers studied their culture and technology. In a few decades, once the surveys were complete, they would receive an official invitation to join the galactic community. The invitation was never really optional, but the hegemony had learned that most species accepted their fate more easily when they felt like they had chosen it. On the other side of the galaxy, Captain Elena Vasquez piloted her survey ship through the asteroid field beyond Titan Station. The rocks here contained trace amounts of iridium, which Earth needed for its fusion reactors. It was slow, dangerous work, but it kept the colonies supplied with power. Elena had been born on Mars Colony, back when the Red Planet was humanity's greatest achievement. Now, 50 years later, humans had spread to a dozen worlds and were planning to reach even more. The universe felt full of possibilities. She didn't know about the hegemony. None of the humans did. The first contact had happened quietly, just like the hegemony preferred. Their scout ships were invisible to human sensors, using technology that bent light and energy around their hulls. They had been watching humanity for 5 years before making their presence known. The meeting took place in neutral space, far from any human colony. The hegemony sent Ambassador Torvin, a being that looked like a walking tree made of silver. Metal. He was polite, friendly, and spoke perfect English, which he had learned by monitoring human communications. The human delegation was led by Secretary General Harrison Webb, Earth's highest-ranking diplomat. He brought scientists, military officers, and translators, though the translators turned out to be unnecessary. Torvin explained that humanity had been discovered by the galactic community. This was cause for celebration, he said. Humans would be welcomed as younger siblings in a vast family of intelligent species. They would receive guidance, protection, and access to technologies beyond their wildest dreams. There were just a few simple rules to follow. Human military development would be limited to basic defensive systems. No weapons capable of destroying planets or stars. No development of artificial intelligence beyond simple computational systems. No expansion beyond their current 12 worlds without hegemony approval. In exchange, the hegemony would protect human space from hostile forces and provide limited technological assistance. Medical advances that could extend human lifespans. Agricultural improvements to feed growing populations. Clean energy systems that would eliminate pollution. Secretary General Webb asked what would happen if humanity refused these generous terms. Torvin's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the meeting room seemed to drop several degrees. He explained that refusal would be unfortunate. Young species sometimes made poor choices when left to develop without guidance. They tended to create weapons that could destroy entire solar systems. They built artificial intelligences that turned against their creators. They expanded too quickly and exhausted their resources. The hegemony had a responsibility to prevent such disasters. If a species couldn't accept guidance voluntarily, other measures would need to be taken for the good of everyone involved. Of course, Webb signed the agreement 3 days later. That had been 45 years ago. To most humans, the hegemony was a distant but benevolent presence. Their ships occasionally visited human space, always polite and respectful. They shared enough technology to improve human lives while keeping the really advanced stuff to themselves. Some humans weren't happy with the arrangement. Admiral Sarah Shun, now governor of New Geneva Colony, had been a young military officer. During first contact, she remembered the subtle threats behind Torvin's diplomatic words. She had spent decades wondering what humanity might have become without hegemony guidance. New Geneva was one of humanity's agricultural worlds. It's vast. Plains covered with crops that fed 3 other colonies. It was peaceful, productive, and strategically unimportant. The perfect place for someone with inconvenient opinions about galactic politics. Chun stood in her office, looking out at fields of golden wheat that stretched to the horizon. The crops grew better here than they ever had on Earth, thanks to hegemony agricultural enhancements. Her people were healthy, well-fed, and content. She should have been grateful. The hegemony had given humanity exactly what they promised: peace, prosperity, and protection from the dangers of uncontrolled development. But sometimes, late at night, Sean wondered what those dangers might have been. What discoveries had humanity missed? What achievements had they been denied? What might they have built if they had been allowed to reach for the stars without someone else holding the ladder? These were dangerous thoughts in the age of the hegemony. Not forbidden exactly, but strongly discouraged. The galactic community thrived on cooperation and consensus. Individual ambition led to conflict. Unrestricted development led to chaos. Chun had learned to keep her questions to herself. 3,000 light-years away, on the Grand Nexus, Commander Zefter finished reviewing the latest reports from human space. Everything was proceeding normally. The humans were developing within acceptable parameters. Their population was growing at a sustainable rate. Their technology remained safely primitive. He closed the file and moved on to the next item on his agenda. Another species in Sector 4821 was showing signs of military expansion beyond authorized levels. They would need to receive a diplomatic reminder about the importance of galactic stability. The hegemony's work was never finished, but it was rewarding. 3,000 years of peace was an achievement worth protecting. The younger species might not always understand the wisdom of their guidance, but someday they would be grateful. Someday they would understand that the hegemony's way was the only way that worked. In the depths of space, the galaxy continued its ancient rotation, carrying billions of worlds and trillions of beings through the cosmic dark. Most of them lived and died without ever knowing how carefully their lives were managed, how thoroughly their potential was controlled. It was a good system, a stable system, a system that had worked for 3 millennia and would continue working. For 3 millennia, more. At least, that's what everyone believed. The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a hegemony courier ship that dropped out of hyperspace without warning. Governor Sarah Chun was having coffee in her office when her aide burst through the door, face pale with worry. The official communication was written in the formal style that the hegemony used for important announcements. Behind the polite words and diplomatic language, the meaning was clear. New Geneva Colony had been selected for resource optimization protocols. Effective immediately, the human population would be relocated to designated residential areas, while hegemony industrial teams prepared the planet for enhanced mineral extraction. Chun read the message 3 times before the full impact hit her. They were being kicked off their own world. 40,000 colonists who had spent 20 years building farms, homes, and communities were being told to pack up and move to what amounted to prison camps while aliens strip mined their planet. Relocation would be temporary, the message assured her. Once the mining operations were complete, the colonists could return to designated areas that would be set aside for continued agricultural production. This might take anywhere from 50 to 200 years, depending on the mineral yields. Chun's hands shook as she set down the data pad. She had always known this day might come. The hegemony was very good at making their demands sound reasonable, but she wasn't fooled by the diplomatic language. This wasn't resource optimization. This was theft. Her aide, a young man named Marcus Torres, watched her carefully. "Governor, what are your orders?" Chun stood up and walked to the window. Outside, she could see families working in the fields, children playing in the irrigation channels between crop rows. Her people had built something beautiful here. They had turned a barren world into a garden that fed 3 other colonies. "Send a message to the hegemony courier," she said quietly. "Tell them that New Geneva Colony respectfully declines their generous offer." Marcus stared at her. "Governor, we can't refuse." "No one refuses the hegemony." Chun turned to face him. For the first time in years, she felt like the military officer she used to be, instead of the diplomatic governor she had become. "Marcus, get me a direct line to every colony administrator, every ship captain, and every military commander in human space. And get me Admiral Harrison on Earth." The young man's eyes widened. "You're really going to do this?" "Yes," Chun said. "I'm really going to do this." The hegemony response team arrived 6 hours later. 3 ships materialized in orbit around New Geneva, their sleek hulls gleaming in the light of the system's star. The lead vessel opened communications immediately. Ambassador Kelvon appeared on Shin's screen, his reptilian features arranged in what passed for a smile among his species. Behind him, she could see the bridge of his ship, all smooth curves and glowing displays that spoke of technology centuries ahead of anything humans possessed. "Governor Chun," Kelvon said, his voice carrying a slight hiss. "I understand there has been some confusion regarding our resource optimization proposal. Perhaps we can discuss this misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding," Chun replied. "New Geneva Colony refuses to participate in your optimization protocols. This is our world. These are our people. You have no right to force us from our homes." Kelvin's smile faded. Governor, I think you may not fully understand the situation. The hegemony has authority over resource distribution throughout this sector. Your colony exists at our discretion. Our colony exists because we built it, Chun shot back. We cleared the land, planted the crops, and created everything you see here. If you want our resources, you can trade for them like civilized beings. The alien's eyes narrowed. Governor, I strongly advise you to reconsider. The hegemony has been generous in our treatment of humanity, but that generosity is not unlimited. There are consequences for species that refuse to cooperate with galactic stability. Chun felt her heart racing, but her voice remained steady. Are you threatening us, Ambassador? I am explaining reality, Kelvin replied. You have 24 hours to begin voluntary relocation procedures. After that time, we will implement involuntary protocols. The communication ended, leaving Chun staring at a blank screen. She had just declared war on the most powerful force in the galaxy, and she had done it with nothing but harsh words and stubborn pride. Marcus was already working at his console, coordinating with the other colony administrators. The response from Earth had been swift and clear. Admiral Harrison, now Secretary General, officially condemned Chun's actions and ordered her to comply with hegemony demands. Unofficially, supplies and equipment had begun moving toward the outer colonies, through channels that didn't officially exist. Humanity had been preparing for this day longer than most people knew. The first hegemony landing craft touched down. 18 hours later, Chun watched from the colony's command center as sleek white shuttles settled onto the landing fields like predatory birds. Alien soldiers emerged, their armor gleaming in the afternoon sun, carrying weapons that hummed. With deadly energy, they moved with the confidence of beings who had never faced serious resistance. Every species in the galaxy had learned to submit when the hegemony made their intentions clear. There was no reason to expect these primitive humans to be any different. Colonel James Rodriguez, the colony's military commander, had different ideas. Rodriguez was a veteran of the Mars Rebellion, back when Earth's government had tried to impose crushing taxes on the Red Planet's mining operations. He had learned that sometimes the only way to deal with bullies was to hit them in the face as hard as possible. The hegemony soldiers were halfway to the administrative complex when the first improvised explosive device detonated. The alien the front of the formation simply disappeared in a cloud of superheated gas and metal fragments. His companions stood frozen for a moment, their advanced armor and superior training useless against an enemy that refused to follow the rules. Second explosion took out 3 more soldiers. The third killed 5. Rodriguez had spent the past 6 hours turning every piece of mining equipment on the colony into a weapon. Ore processors became missile launchers. Transport vehicles became armored fighting machines. Even the agricultural drones had been fitted with explosive charges and programmed to ram enemy positions. The hegemony soldiers tried to advance, but they found themselves fighting an enemy that attacked from everywhere and nowhere. Humans popped out of irrigation ditches, fired stolen weapons, and disappeared back underground before return fire could find them. They used the colony's own infrastructure as a weapon, turning familiar streets and buildings into a maze of death. Traps in orbit, Ambassador Kelvin watched the battle through his ship's sensors with growing disbelief. His ground forces were trained, equipped, and experienced. They had put down rebellions on dozens of worlds. They should have been able to pacify a single agricultural colony in a matter of hours. Instead, they were being systematically destroyed by farmers with improvised weapons. Sir, his tactical officer reported, we've lost contact with Ground Team Alpha. Ground Team Beta is requesting immediate extraction. Ground Team Gamma is gone. Kelvin stared at the tactical display. In 3 hours of fighting, The humans had eliminated nearly half of his ground forces. They fought like nothing he had ever seen before, throwing themselves at superior enemies with a ferocity that bordered on insanity. "Begin orbital bombardment," he ordered. "Target the administrative, complex, and all major population centers." His weapons officer hesitated. "Sir, that will result in significant civilian casualties. The hegemony prefers to avoid. The hegemony prefers species that know their place," Calvin snapped. "These humans need to learn the consequences of defiance." The orbital bombardment began at sunset. Beams of coherent energy lanced down from the hegemony ships, turning buildings into vapor and carving craters in the earth. The attack was precisely targeted to minimize damage to valuable infrastructure while making the cost of resistance impossible to ignore. Chun and her staff watched from the reinforced bunker beneath the command center as their world burned above them. The bombardment would continue until the colony surrendered or until everyone was dead. Those were the only options the hegemony ever offered. But Chun had one more card to play. The signal went out on frequencies the hegemony didn't monitor, using communication protocols they didn't recognize. Across human space, sleeper transmitters activated and broadcast a simple message to ships and stations that officially didn't exist. The message was only 3 words long: "Light the fires." Admiral Catherine Santos received the signal aboard the mining vessel Deep Prospector, currently operating in the asteroid belt beyond Proxima Colony. She had been waiting for this moment for 15 years, ever since she had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in human space. Deep Prospector wasn't really a mining ship. Neither were the other 47 vessels scattered throughout the outer colonies, all disguised as civilian craft, but carrying military crews and experimental weapons that officially didn't exist. Santos smiled as she gave the order that would change everything. "All ships, this is Admiral Santos. Operation Breakout is now active. Show them what humans do when someone threatens our families." Admiral Vex Moore of the Hegemony First Fleet had put down rebellions on 47 worlds during his long career. He knew exactly how these situations developed and how they ended. A young species would make some foolish gesture of defiance, destroy a few patrol ships, and celebrate their small victory. Then the real fleet would arrive, and the rebellion would collapse within hours. The humans would be no different. His fleet was impressive by any standard. 12 Dreadnought-class ships, each one 3 miles long and carrying enough firepower to sterilize a planet. 60 cruiser-class vessels for tactical support. 200 destroyer-class ships for cleanup operations. Nearly 500 smaller craft for boarding actions and occupation duties. The fleet represented more military power than most species had ever seen gathered in one place. It was designed to end rebellions through shock and overwhelming force, breaking the will of entire civilizations before the shooting even started. Vex Moore stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching the hyperspace readings as his fleet prepared to drop into human space. Intelligence reports suggested the humans had perhaps 50 ships total, mostly converted civilian vessels with primitive weapons. The battle would be over in less than an hour. "Sir, his navigation," officer announced, "we're approaching the target system, dropping to normal space in 30 seconds. Vex Moore nodded and activated the fleet-wide communication system. "All ships, this is Admiral Vex Moore. We are here to restore order and demonstrate the consequences of defying hegemony authority. These humans have forgotten their place in the galactic community. We will remind them." The fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Proxima system, their massive hulls gleaming in the light of the red dwarf star. Sensor sweeps immediately began searching for human vessels, but the tactical displays remained stubbornly empty. "Sir," the sensor officer reported, "I'm not detecting any enemy ships. The system appears to be deserted." Vex Moore frowned. Intelligence had indicated that Proxima Colony was one of humanity's major military installations, home to their primary shipyards and defensive fleet. Where were they? Begin detailed scans of the inner system, he ordered. Check for cloaked vessels or hidden installations. The answer came from an unexpected direction. Instead of emerging from the inner planets, where military logic suggested they should be waiting, the human ships came from everywhere at once. They rose out of asteroid fields, detached from the hulls of space debris, and materialized from what had appeared to be empty space, the first indication that something was wrong came when Lieutenant Kekstar at the sensor station suddenly shouted, "Sir, multiple contacts approaching from all vectors. They're moving fast." Dexmore spun to look at the tactical display and felt his blood turn cold. Hundreds of red dots were converging on his fleet from every direction, moving at speeds that seemed impossible for ships of their size. These weren't the converted civilian vessels his intelligence reports had described. These were purpose-built warships, designed for speed and maneuverability. "All ships, battle formation Delta," he commanded. "Raise shields and prepare for." The first human ship to reach his fleet was no larger than a hegemony shuttle, but it moved like a bullet fired from a gun. Instead of slowing to engage at a safe distance like any rational commander would do, it aimed directly at the nearest dreadnought and accelerated. The hegemony ship's energy shields flared as they tried to deflect the incoming projectile, but the human vessel wasn't firing energy weapons. It was itself the weapon, its hull packed with nuclear charges and accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed. The impact was visible across the entire system. The dreadnought crushing victory simply ceased to exist, replaced by an expanding sphere of superheated plasma that caught two nearby cruisers in its wake. What in the void was that? Dexmore demanded. His question was answered by a dozen more human ships making identical attacks. They came in fast, hit hard, and died in explosions that took massive hegemony vessels with them. It was suicide, but it was effective suicide on a scale that defied all military logic. "Sir," his communications officer reported, voice shaking, "I'm receiving a transmission from the human forces." "Put it through," Dexmore ordered. The voice that came through the speakers was calm, almost conversational. It belonged to Admiral Catherine Santos, though Dexmore didn't know her name yet. "This is Admiral Santos of the Human Defense Force. You have entered our space without permission and with hostile intent. You have one chance to withdraw your forces and return to hegemony territory. If you refuse, we will destroy every ship in your fleet." Dexmore couldn't believe what he was hearing. A primitive species was giving him an ultimatum. Him, a fleet admiral of the hegemony with over 2 centuries of military experience. "This is Admiral Dexmore of the hegemony first." "Fleet," he replied. "You are in violation of galactic law and will surrender immediately. Your species will submit to hegemony authority or face the consequences." There was a brief pause before the human admiral responded. Wrong answer. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations, though most of the hegemony's military leadership would refuse to believe the reports. The human ships attacked in waves, but not in any formation that hegemony tacticians recognized. They came from above and below the plane of battle, using 3-dimensional thinking that caught the alien fleet off guard. They employed hit-and-run tactics, striking fast and disappearing before return fire could lock onto them. Worse, they seemed to have no regard for their own survival. Human ships would ram hegemony vessels at full speed, trading their lives for enemy kills at a ratio that made no tactical sense. They used their own vessels as guided missiles, turning each ship into a potential planet killer. The hegemonies, energy shields designed to deflect the coherent energy weapons that every civilized species used, proved nearly useless against solid projectiles moving at relativistic speeds. The aliens' plasma cannons and particle beams couldn't track targets that moved like interceptor missiles and fought like guided bombs. But the real shock came when the humans revealed their true innovation. Instead of trying to match hegemony, technology, they had developed something entirely different. Their ships were small, fast, and incredibly numerous. Where the hegemony had built a dozen massive dreadnoughts, humanity had built 1,000 missile ships. Admiral Santos watched the battle from the bridge of her command ship, hidden in the shadow of a dead moon. Her tactical display showed the hegemony fleet being systematically torn apart by ships that had cost humanity everything to build, but were proving their worth in blood and fire. "Admiral," her tactical officer reported, "the enemy flagship is trying to withdraw to hyperspace jump range." Santos smiled coldly. "Signal the Phantom Squadron. Time to show them why we call it the Phantom Squadron." Deep in the asteroid belt, 12 human ships that had been disguised as mining platforms suddenly activated drives that shouldn't have existed. They were equipped with experimental FTL systems that humanity had developed in secret, based on principles that the hegemony had specifically forbidden young species to research. The ships appeared directly around Dexmoor's flagship, materializing from hyperspace at point-blank range. The Eternal Dominion's shields flared as nuclear warheads detonated against its hull, each explosion bright enough to blind unprotected eyes. Dexmoor felt his ship shaking around him as systems failed throughout. "The massive vessel. Damage report," he shouted. "Sir, we've lost main power to sections 12 through 18. Our hyperspace engines are offline. Structural integrity is down to 40%. The Admiral stared at his tactical display in disbelief. In less than 2 hours, the humans had destroyed or disabled 3/4 of his fleet. His remaining ships were scattered across the system, most of them damaged and trying to reach escape vectors. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The hegemony had ruled the galaxy for 3,000 years because they possessed overwhelming technological superiority. No young species had the knowledge or resources to challenge them directly. Yet somehow, these primitive humans had built a fleet that could not only fight hegemony forces, but defeat them decisively. "Sir," his communications officer announced, "I'm receiving another transmission from the human admiral." Santos's voice filled the bridge again, but this time it carried a note of satisfaction. "Admiral Dexmoor, your fleet is broken. Your ships are dying. Your crews are watching their comrades burn in the void. Do you still want to discuss the consequences of defying authority?" Dexmoor looked around his bridge at the faces of his surviving crew members. They were all staring at him, waiting for orders that he wasn't sure how to give. In all his years of service, he had never faced an enemy that fought like this. The humans didn't just want to win. They wanted to completely destroy anything that threatened them, even if it meant dying in the process. They turned their own ships into weapons and their crews into ammunition. They fought like nothing he had ever encountered before. "What do you want?" he asked finally. "I want you to go back to your masters," Santos replied. "I want you to tell them exactly what happened here. I want you to make sure they understand that humanity will not submit, will not surrender, and will not be moved from our worlds." The news of humanity's victory at Proxima traveled through the galaxy like wildfire, carried by merchant ships, diplomatic couriers, and the secret communication networks that connected oppressed peoples across 1,000 worlds. For the first time in 3 millennia, species that had forgotten the meaning of freedom began to remember what it felt like to hope. On the industrial world of Kermax Prime, the Deltari workers in the thorium processing plants stopped their machines and walked out. Their overseer, a hegemony administrator named Veltoth, tried to restore order using the neural pain devices that had kept the population compliant for centuries. But the workers had heard about humans who chose death before submission, and Suddenly, the threat of suffering didn't seem as frightening as the promise of continued slavery. The rebellion spread to 12 worlds in the Deltari system within a week. Ancient weapons caches, hidden since the original conquest 2,000 years ago, were unearthed and distributed. Ships that had been disguised as cargo haulers revealed their hidden weapon systems. The Deltari had never forgotten how to fight. They had simply been waiting for someone to show them that victory was possible. Similar uprisings erupted across the galaxy. The Nexari threw off their chains in the spiral arm sectors. The Corvin initiated strikes that shut down crucial mining operations. Even the peaceful Ashanti began sabotaging the communication networks they had been forced to maintain for their hegemony masters. High Counselor Zephyr stood in the emergency session of the Hegemony Council, listening to reports of chaos from across their empire. 47 separate rebellions were active, with more starting every day. Military forces that should have been converging on human space were being diverted to put down uprisings on worlds that had been peaceful for centuries. The situation is contained, insisted General Cormax, the hegemony's supreme military commander. His species, the Catherian Empire, had built their reputation on crushing rebellions with overwhelming force. These uprisings are emotional responses to propaganda. Once we demonstrate the consequences of defiance, order will be restored. Counselor Vexara of the Thermal Hegemony disagreed, her crystalline body glowing with agitation. You said the same thing about the humans. How did that work out? The council chambers fell silent. The disaster at Proxima had shaken everyone's confidence in hegemony military doctrine. An entire fleet, destroyed by a species that shouldn't have been able to threaten a single patrol ship. The humans caught us off guard, Cormax admitted. We underestimated their technological development and their willingness to sacrifice themselves. Those mistakes will not be repeated. What mistakes? Zephyr asked coldly. Intelligence reported exactly what they observed. The humans appeared primitive because they wanted to appear primitive. They've been planning this rebellion for decades. Maybe since first contact. The uncomfortable truth hung in the air like a toxic cloud. The hegemony's entire system of control was based on the assumption that young species lacked the knowledge and resources to challenge established authority. If that assumption was wrong, if species could hide their true capabilities while secretly preparing for war, then every peaceful world in the galaxy was potentially a threat. We need to accelerate the military response, Cormax declared. Deploy the second and third fleets to human space immediately. Crush their military forces before these rebellions spread further. And what about the rebellions that are already spreading? Vexara demanded. The Deltari have seized control of 6 systems. The Nexari are threatening our supply lines to the outer rim. We need those fleets to maintain order. Then we use the final protocol, Cormax said quietly. The council chambers went completely silent. The final protocol hadn't been mentioned in official discussions for over 1,000 years. It was the hegemony's ultimate deterrent, a weapon so terrible that its mere existence had kept the galaxy peaceful. You can't be serious, whispered Counselor Dexman of the Void Walkers. The final protocol hasn't been activated since the Nethran Wars. The collateral damage would be acceptable, Cormax finished. If we allow these rebellions to continue, we risk losing everything we've built. Better to sacrifice a few systems than to watch the entire galactic order collapse. The final protocol was simple in concept and devastating in execution. The hegemony would identify the homeworld of each rebellious species and deploy Star Killer, weapons that would cause their suns to go supernova. The resulting destruction would eliminate not only the rebels, but any potential for future resistance. It was genocide on a stellar scale, and it had worked before. I invoke emergency powers, Cormax announced. The final protocol is authorized. For immediate deployment. Target selection will begin within the hour. Zephyr felt something cold settle in his stomach. The hegemony had always claimed to be civilized, to rule through wisdom rather than terror. But when their authority was truly challenged, they revealed their true nature. They were tyrants who had maintained power through the implicit threat of total annihilation. Meanwhile, in human space, President Martinez received intelligence reports that made his blood run cold. Hegemony deep space sensors had detected massive energy buildups in the galactic core, consistent with the activation of weapons that humanity had only theorized about in their darkest nightmares. "They're going to kill stars," Admiral Santos reported from her position with the main fleet. Our Zen archaeology teams found references to similar weapons in the ruins on Calmer 4. The hegemony has done this before. Martinez stared at the holographic display showing human space and the dozens of allied species that had joined the rebellion. Each point of light represented billions of lives that would be snuffed out if the hegemony succeeded in their plan. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Based on the energy readings, maybe 2 weeks before the first wave of star killers is deployed. They'll target Earth first to make an example. Then the rebel homeworlds, starting with the most militarily significant." Martinez closed his eyes and made the decision that would define humanity's place in galactic history. "Admiral, activate Operation Prometheus. All fleets, all assets, everything we've got." "Sir, that will expose our entire strategic reserve." If we fail, we're all dead anyway," Martinez replied. "At least this way, we go down fighting." Operation Prometheus was humanity's ultimate gamble, developed in the deepest black sites and hidden even from most human leaders. While the hegemony had focused on building larger ships and more powerful weapons, humanity had taken a different approach. They had built weapons designed to kill gods. Deep in the Oort cloud beyond Pluto, installations that had been disguised as research stations suddenly revealed their true purpose. Massive accelerator rings, each one the size of a small moon, began charging their exotic matter cores. These weren't just weapons. They were engines of destruction that could reach across interstellar space and strike targets thousands of light years away. Admiral Santos led the largest fleet humanity had ever assembled toward the galactic core. 3,000 ships, most of them converted civilian vessels crewed by volunteers who knew they were flying to their deaths. They carried experimental weapons, prototype technologies, and the desperate hope of a species that refused to kneel. The battle for the Grand Nexus began when human forces dropped out of hyperspace just outside the hegemony's most heavily defended system. The aliens had been expecting an attack, but not from this direction. Human intelligence had identified weaknesses in the station's defensive grid, gaps that could be exploited by small, fast ships willing to make suicide runs. The first wave of human attackers consisted of unmanned vessels, controlled by artificial intelligences that the hegemony had forbidden humanity to develop. These AI-guided missiles struck with inhuman precision, targeting specific weak points in the Grand Nexus's shields and creating openings for the manned ships to follow. Santos led the second wave personally, her ship diving through the defensive grid at speeds that would have torn apart anything built with normal materials. Human engineers had developed new alloys and structural techniques during their decades of secret preparation, creating vessels that could survive stresses that would destroy conventional spacecraft. The hegemony's response was everything humanity had expected and feared. Weapons that could vaporize entire fleets opened fire, filling space with deadly energy. The Grand Nexus itself proved to be a weapon as much as a space station, its towers sprouting gun emplacements that had remained hidden for millennia. Human ships died by the hundreds, but they kept coming. For every vessel destroyed, 2 more took its place. They fought with the fury of a species that had nothing left to lose, using tactics that no civilized military would consider. When conventional attacks failed, they resorted to ramming. When ramming failed, they used their ships as delivery systems for nuclear weapons. When nuclear weapons proved insufficient, they employed antimatter charges that turned entire sections of the station into clouds of superheated gas. But the real target wasn't the Grand Nexus itself. While the massive space battle raged in the system's outer regions, a small team of human infiltrators made their way to the station's core, where the hegemony's star-killer weapons were housed. 6 months after the destruction of the Grand Nexus, the galaxy was a very different place. The hegemony still existed, but its grip on power was failing everywhere at once. Rebellion had become a plague that spread from world to world, system to system, until even the core territories were no longer safe. Admiral Santos stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Phoenix Rising, watching the surrender of the hegemony's Fourth Fleet. The once mighty armada hung motionless in space. There, weapons powered down, and their shields collapsed. It was the 7th major hegemony force to surrender this month. The alien commanders no longer spoke of crushing rebellions or restoring order. They talked about terms, about amnesty, about finding some way to preserve what remained of the civilization they had spent millennia building. The galaxy's most powerful military was learning to beg. Admiral, her communications officer announced, we're receiving a priority transmission from Earth. It's President Martinez. Santos nodded, and the president's image appeared in the air before her. Martinez looked older than he had at the start of the war, his hair gone completely gray and new lines etched around his eyes. Leading humanity through its first interstellar. War had aged him decades in less than a year. Catherine, he said, using her first name as he always did in private communications. How are the negotiations going? Better than expected, Santos replied. The Hegemony Council has agreed to most of our terms. Complete withdrawal from all rebel territories, dismantling of their remaining star-killer weapons, and reparations for the worlds they've damaged during the war. And the big question? Santos smiled grimly. They want humanity to take their place. They're offering us control of the galaxy with all the responsibilities that entails. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. This was the conversation they had both known was coming, the decision that would shape the future of every species in the galaxy. The hegemony was broken, their authority shattered, but something had to replace them. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does politics. What's your recommendation, Admiral? That we tell them to go to hell, Santos replied immediately. We didn't fight this war to become the new oppressors. We fought it to be free. And the practical concerns? The trade, networks, the territorial disputes, the 100 different crises that will emerge if there's no central authority. Santos looked out at the stars surrounding her ship, each one representing thousands of worlds that were now deciding their own fates for the first time in millennia. Let the species figure it out for themselves. Give them the chance to succeed, or fail on their own terms. 3 weeks later, representatives from 47 different species gathered in the ruins of the Grand Nexus for the most important conference in galactic history. The meeting was held in one of the few sections of the station that had survived the human attack, a vast amphitheater that had once hosted hegemony, ceremonies celebrating their dominion over the stars. Now he would witness the birth of something entirely new. President Martinez addressed the assembly personally, speaking not as the leader of a conquering force, but as one voice among many. Behind him stood the flags of dozens of species, each one representing worlds that had thrown off the chains of servitude and chosen to stand together as equals. For 3,000 years, Martinez began, this galaxy has been ruled by fear. Fear of punishment, fear of rebellion, fear of change. The hegemony maintained order by making sure that every species knew exactly what would happen if they stepped out of line. He paused, looking out at the assembled delegates. Former slaves sat beside former masters. species that had been enemies, for centuries now working together to build a better future. But fear is not stability. Fear is not peace. Fear is just another word for slavery with better public relations. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. These beings had all lived under the hegemony's rule. They understood the difference between genuine peace and the silence that comes from having no choice. Humanity doesn't want to rule the galaxy, Martinez continued. We've seen what that kind of power does to those who wield it. Instead, we propose something that has never been tried on this scale: voluntary cooperation between free and equal species. The proposal he outlined was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. The Free Species Compact would be an alliance of independent worlds and systems, united by common principles rather than shared masters. Each species would govern itself according to its own values and traditions. Disputes would be resolved through negotiation rather than force. Trade would be based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. Most importantly, no single species or group of species would have the power to impose their will on others. The galaxy would be governed by consensus, not conquest. The debates that followed were intense and often heated. Some species, particularly those that had held positions of authority under the hegemony, argued that such a system was impossible. Without central control, they claimed, the galaxy would descend into chaos and war. Others worried about practical matters. Who would maintain the hyperspace trade routes? Who would coordinate disaster relief when worlds faced natural catastrophes? Who would defend against threats from outside the galaxy? The answers came from unexpected sources. The Deltari, who had spent 2 millennia as laborers in hegemony factories, revealed that they had secretly maintained much of the galaxy's industrial infrastructure and were willing to share their knowledge freely. The Nexari offered their expertise in interstellar communication networks. The Ashanti proposed cultural exchange programs that would help different species understand each other better. Even some former hegemony species chose to join the compact. The thermal hegemony's counselor Vexara stood before the assembly and formally renounced her people's claims to superiority, asking forgiveness for the suffering they had caused and offering their advanced medical knowledge to help heal the true galaxy's wounds. The most emotional moment came when the Corvin delegate, representing a species that had been enslaved for over 1,000 years, simply said, "We choose freedom." The words were translated into 47 different languages and broadcast across the galaxy, becoming the unofficial motto of the new alliance. But the real test of the Free Species Compact came 3 months later, when the first major crisis arose. The hegemony's withdrawal from the Outer Rim had left a power vacuum that was quickly filled by pirates, raiders, and worse things that had been hiding in the dark spaces between stars. The attacks began on isolated colonies and trade routes, but quickly escalated to full-scale invasions of populated systems. The raiders weren't interested in conquest or control. They simply wanted to destroy everything the new alliance was trying to build. Under the old system, the hegemony would have responded with overwhelming force, crushing the threat, but also establishing their authority over the affected regions. The Free Species Compact had defined a different way. Admiral Santos, now serving as the coordinator of joint military operations, worked with defense forces from a dozen species to develop a response that would protect innocent lives without becoming a tool of oppression. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Voluntary defense pacts between neighboring systems, supported by rapid response fleets that could intervene when requested but had no authority to occupy or control. The campaign against the raiders became a proving ground for the new alliance. Human ships fought alongside Deltari cruisers and Nexari fighters, their crews learning to work together despite different languages, cultures, and military traditions. They shared tactics, technology, and resources, creating a combined force. That was more effective than anything the individual species could have fielded alone. The decisive battle took place in the Vega system, where a massive raider fleet had gathered to assault one of the galaxy's major trade hubs. The Allied fleet that met them was smaller in terms of total tonnage, but it fought with a coordination and determination that the raiders had never encountered. Human tactics were combined with Deltari engineering and Nexari navigation skills, creating strategies that no single species could have developed. When conventional weapons proved insufficient, the Allies improvised solutions on the fly, adapting to changing circumstances in ways that rigid military doctrines couldn't match. The raiders were defeated, but more importantly, they were defeated by beings who chose to fight together rather than being forced to do so by higher authority. The victory belonged to everyone who had participated, and the lessons learned would make future cooperation even more effective. As the first year of the Free Species Compact drew to a close, President Martinez stood once again in the rebuilt conference chamber, addressing an assembly that had grown to include over 60 different species. The ruins of the Grand Nexus had been transformed into something new, a meeting place where equals could gather to shape their shared future. "A year ago," he said, "we were all subjects of an empire that claimed to know what was best for us. Today, we are partners in an alliance that recognizes something the hegemony never understood. That diversity of thought, culture, and approach makes us stronger, not weaker." He gestured to the assembled delegates, representing more variety of life than had ever cooperated on such a scale. "We don't always agree. We